Authoritarianism is a form of government. Juan Lintz, whose 1964 description of authoritarianism is influential, characterized authoritarian regimes as political systems by four qualities: limited, not responsible, political pluralism, that is, constraints on political institutions and groups, a basis for legitimacy based on emotion, especially the identification of the regime as a necessary evil to combat easily recognizable societal problems, such as underdevelopment or insurgency, neither intensive nor extensive political mobilization, and constraints on the mass public and formally ill-defined executive power, often shifting or vague, authoritarian government and states. Lintz distinguished new forms of authoritarianism from personalistic dictatorships and totalitarian states, taking Francois Spain as an example. Unlike personalistic dictatorships, new forms of authoritarianism have institutionalized representation of a variety of actors. Unlike totalitarian states, the regime relies on passive mass acceptance rather than popular support. Several subtypes of authoritarian regimes have been identified by Lintz and others. Lintz identified the two most basic subtypes as traditional authoritarian regimes and bureaucratic military authoritarian regimes. Traditional authoritarian regimes are those in which the ruling authority is maintained in power through a combination of appeals to traditional legitimacy, patron-client ties and repression, which is carried out by an apparatus bound to the ruling authority through personal loyalties. An example is Ethiopia under Haile Selassie. Bureaucratic military authoritarian regimes are those governed by a coalition of military officers and technocrats who act pragmatically within the limits of their bureaucratic mentality. Mark J. Gasiorowski suggests that it is best to distinguish simple military authoritarian regimes from bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, in which a powerful group of technocrats uses the state apparatus to try to rationalize and develop the economy, such as South Korea under Park Chung-hee. Lintz also has identified three other subtypes of authoritarian regime: corporatist or organic statistic, racial and ethnic, democracy, and post-totalitarian. Corporatist authoritarian regimes are those in which corporatism institutions are used extensively by the state to co-opt and demobilize powerful interest groups. This type has been studied most extensively in Latin America. Racial and ethnic democracies are those in which certain racial or ethnic groups enjoy full democratic rights while others are largely or entirely denied those rights, such as in South Africa under apartheid. Post-totalitarian authoritarian regimes are those in which totalitarian institutions remain, but where ideological orthodoxy has declined in favor of routinization. Repression has declined. The state's top leadership is less personalized and more secure, and the level of mass mobilization has declined substantially. Examples include the Soviet Eastern Bloc states in the mid-1980s. Authoritarian regimes are also sometimes subcategorized by whether they are personalistic or populist. Personalistic authoritarian regimes are characterized by arbitrary rule and authority exercised mainly through patronage networks and coercion, rather than through institutions and formal rules. Personalistic authoritarian regimes have been seen in post-colonial Africa. By contrast, populist authoritarian regimes are mobilizational regimes in which a strong, charismatic, manipulative leader rules through a coalition involving key lower-class groups. Examples include Argentina under Perón and Nasser in Egypt. Authoritarianism is characterized by highly concentrated and centralized power maintained by political repression and the exclusion of potential challengers. It uses political parties and mass organizations to mobilize people around the goals of the regime. Adam Przeworski has theorized that authoritarian equilibrium rests mainly on lies, fear and economic prosperity. Authoritarianism also tends to embrace the informal and unregulated exercise of political power, a leadership that is self-appointed and even if elected cannot be displaced by citizens' free choice among competitors, the arbitrary deprivation of civil liberties, and little tolerance for meaningful opposition. A range of social controls also attempt to stifle civil society, while political stability is maintained by control over and support of the armed forces, a bureaucracy staffed by the regime, and creation of allegiance through various means of socialization and indoctrination. Authoritarian political systems may be weakened through inadequate performance to demands of the people. Vestal writes that the tendency to respond to challenges to authoritarianism through tighter control instead of adaptation is a significant weakness, and that this overly rigid approach fails to adapt to changes or to accommodate growing demands on the part of the populace or even groups within the system, because the legitimacy of the state is dependent on performance. Authoritarian states that fail to adapt may collapse. Authoritarianism is marked by indefinite political tenure of the ruler or ruling party or other authority. The transition from an authoritarian system to a more democratic form of government is referred to as democratization. John Duckett suggests a link between authoritarianism and collectivism, asserting that both stand in opposition to individualism. Duckett writes that both authoritarianism and collectivism submerge individual rights and goals to group goals, expectations and conformities. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is an extreme version of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism primarily differs from totalitarianism in that social and economic institutions exist that are not under governmental control. Building on the work of Yale political scientist Juan Lintz, Paul C. Sondrol of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs has examined the characteristics of authoritarian and totalitarian dictators and organized them in a chart. Sondrol argues that while both authoritarianism and totalitarianism are forms of autocracy, they differ in key dichotomies. Unlike their bland and generally unpopular authoritarian brethren, totalitarian dictators develop a charismatic mystique and a mass-based, pseudo-democratic interdependence with their followers via the conscious manipulation of a prophetic image. Concomitant role conceptions differentiate totalitarians from authoritarians. Authoritarians view themselves as individual beings largely content to control, and often maintain, the status quo. Totalitarian self-conceptions are largely teleological. The tyrant is less a person than an indispensable function, to guide and reshape the universe. Consequently, the utilization of power for personal aggrandizement is more evident among authoritarians than totalitarians. Lacking the binding appeal of ideology, authoritarians support their rule by a mixture of instilling fear and granting rewards to loyal collaborators, engendering a kleptocracy. Compared to totalitarianism, the authoritarian state still maintains a certain distinction between state and society. It is only concerned with political power, and as long as that is not contested, it gives society a certain degree of liberty. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, invades private life and asphyxiates it. Another distinction is that authoritarianism is not animated by utopian ideals in the way totalitarianism is. It does not attempt to change the world and human nature. Karl Joachim Friedrich writes that a totalist ideology, a party reinforced by a secret police, and monopoly control of industrial mass society, are the three features of totalitarian regimes that distinguish them from other autocracies. Authoritarianism and democracy. Authoritarianism and democracy are not fundamentally opposed to one another. It is thus definitely possible for democracies to possess strong authoritarian elements, for both feature a form of submission to authority. And a liberal democracy is distinguished from liberal democracy in that liberal democracies lack the more democratic features of liberal democracies. such as the rule of law, an independent judiciary, along with a further distinction that liberal democracies have rarely made war with one another. More recent research has extended the theory and finds that more democratic countries tend to have few militarized interstate disputes causing less battle deaths with one another, and that democracies have much fewer civil wars. Some commentators, such as Seymour Martin Lipset, believe that low-income authoritarian regimes have certain technocratic, efficiency-enhancing advantages over low-income democracies, helping authoritarian regimes generate development. Morton H. Halperin, Joseph D. Siegler, and Michael M. Weinstein counter this belief, arguing that the evidence has showed that there is no authoritarian advantage, and that there is a democratic advantage instead. Halperin et al. Argue that democracies realize superior development performance over authoritarianism. They point out that poor democracies are more likely to have steadier economic growth, and less likely to experience economic and humanitarian catastrophes than authoritarian regimes, that civil liberties act as a curb on corruption and misuse of resources, and that democracies are more adaptable. Halperin point out that the vast majority of refugee crises and financial catastrophes occur in authoritarian regimes. Studies suggest that several health indicators have a stronger and more significant association with democracy than they have with GDP per capita, size of the public sector, or income inequality. A prominent economist, Amartya Sen, has theorized that no functioning liberal democracy has ever suffered a large-scale famine. Research shows that the democratic nations have much less democide or murder by government. However, it should be noted that those were also moderately developed nations before applying liberal democratic policies. Research by the World Bank suggests that political institutions are extremely important in determining the prevalence of corruption, and that parliamentary systems, political stability and freedom of the press are all associated with lower corruption. One study has concluded that terrorism is most common in nations with intermediate political freedom. The nations with the least amount of terrorism are the most and least democratic nations. Examples of authoritarian states. There is no precise definition of authoritarianism, but several annual measurements are attempted, including Freedom House's annual Freedom in the World report. The following is a non-exhaustive list of examples of states which are currently characterized as authoritarian: Armenia under the Republican Party of Armenia, Azerbaijan under Ilham Aliyev, Bahrain under the House of Khalifa, Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko on account of Lukashenko's self-described authoritarian style of government, Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge and Hun Sen, People's Republic of China under the Chinese Communist Party. Some scholars have deemed the Chinese system a fragmented authoritarianism, a negotiated state, or a consultative authoritarian regime. Cuba under Fidel and Raúl Castro, Egypt under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Iran under Ali Khamenei. Lintz wrote in 2000 that it is difficult to fit the Iranian regime into the existing typology, as it combines the ideological bent of totalitarianism with the limited pluralism of authoritarianism and holds regular elections in which candidates advocate differing policies and incumbents are often defeated. Laos under the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, Republic of Macedonia under Nikola Gruevski, North Korea under the rule of the Kim dynasty and Korean Workers' Party, Russia under Vladimir Putin, described as really a mixture of authoritarianism and managed democracy, Saudi Arabia under the House of Saud, Syria under Bashar al-Assad, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, Vietnam under the Vietnamese Communist Party. Examples of states which were historically authoritarian: Argentina under the Argentine Revolution period of military rule and later during the justicialista rule of Juan Perón. Brazil during both the Estado Novo period under Getúlio Vargas and under military government from a 1964 coup until a transition to democracy in the early and mid-1980s. Burma from a 1962 coup until a transition to democracy beginning in 2011. Chile under Augusto Pinochet until a transition to democracy in 1990. Egypt under Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak. Libya under Muammar Gaddafi until his deposition and death in 2011 at the end of the Libyan civil war. Portugal under the Estado Novo regime of António de Oliveira Salazar and Marcelo Caetano from 1932 to 1974. Spain under Francisco Franco from 1936 to 1975, when the Spanish transition to democracy began after Franco's death. South Africa under the National Party from 1948 until the end of apartheid in 1994. South Korea from the early 1970s until a transition to democracy in 1987. Taiwan from the February 28 incident of 1947 until a transition to democracy in the late 1980s. Turkey from 1925 through 1945, when a transition to democracy began. Anti-authoritarianism. After World War II, there was a strong sense of anti-authoritarianism based on anti-fascism in Europe. This was attributed to the active resistance from occupation and to fears arising from the development of superpowers. Anti-authoritarianism also became associated with countercultural and bohemian movements such as the Beat Generation in the 1950s, the hippies in the 1960s and punks in the 1970s. Gender and authoritarianism. According to a study by Brandt and Henry, there is a direct correlation between the rates of gender inequality and the levels of authoritarian ideas in the male and female populations. It was found that in countries with less gender equality, where individualism was encouraged and men occupied the dominant societal roles, women were more likely to support traits such as obedience, which would allow them to survive in an authoritarian environment, and less likely to encourage ideas such as independence and imagination. In countries with higher levels of gender equality, men held more authoritarian views. It is theorized that this occurs due to the stigma attached to individuals who question the cultural norms set by the dominant individuals and establishments in an authoritarian society as a way to prevent the psychological stress caused by the active ostracizing of the stigmatized individuals. Works cited: Juan J. Lintz, An Authoritarian Regime. The Case of Spain, in Cleavages, Ideologies and Party Systems.